And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" And he said to them, "Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men.'" And he said to them, "You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die.' But you say, 'If a man tells his father or his mother, whatever you would have gained from me is Corban, that is given to God,' then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father and mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. In many such things you do." So again, we're not going to dive into this section here. That's what Sunday is going to be about. But I wanted to open with a pretty simple question. And it seems simple on the surface until I try to define it, and then I'm like, ugh, maybe it's not as easy. So what's an example of a tradition that maybe you have in your household? How do we talk about traditions? Yes, ma'am. Okay. Yeah. When you think tradition, who here immediately thought holidays to some extent? Couple hands. The Shutt family, not the most tradition family. We are as far from Hallmark as possible. The Shutt family, just me and my brother. Our tradition was we ate orange cinnamon rolls from Pillsbury every Christmas morning. That was the extent. Other than that, we have no traditions, no structure, not great. Brooke's family, on the other hand, she's one of 4 girls. My first Christmas there was terrifying. It was like every weird Hallmark thing, but in real life, right in front of me, and it terrified me. They had so many traditions. They read a story at a certain time. They made cookies a certain way. They decorated them in a certain way. They had a lot of traditions. And those traditions, when it comes back to the definition, a lot of the times passed down, right, from family to family. I'm guessing Brooke and I will probably take something. I know I'll have mine because mine's simple, but something there, and it'll be passed down and passed down. And maybe you have other traditions around birthdays or anniversaries or Valentine's Day. I don't know. So that, to me, is kind of where my mind goes when it comes to tradition. So I'm going to ask you all to do me a favor. I want you to take that version of tradition and pull it out of your mind, and we're going to just set it aside. We're not going to throw it in the trash. There's nothing wrong with it, but we're going to set it aside. Because for the remainder of class, when I'm talking about tradition, I'm not talking about Pillsbury orange rolls, right? That is not, if we can get as etymology heavy as we want to, that is not tradition in the sense of what we read in the scripture. Unfortunately, it's the same word that we use, and so it makes sense that our brain would go straight there. That's the world we live in. But when it comes to tradition, that is not what you see in the Bible. So talking about tradition, you kind of walk into this conversation of Jewish authority. And if you were to ask a Jew, a practicing religious Jew in the days of, we'll just play it safe, we'll say Jesus' time. If you were to ask them essentially how many sources of authority they had when it came to their life, how they governed it, how they worshiped, whatever, how many sources do you think they would say? Sometimes the simple answer is the best one, right? So who is the source of it all, right? God. So God is the source of authority for a practicing Jew. That part I get. I think that's easy. I think we can feel the same way. Something that I have been discovering as I read more and try to do more research is a very interesting part of this that I want to talk about. if you were to ask one of those people how many, essentially how that authority can come to them, that is where the interesting answer pops out for me. If you look traditionally at the Jewish people, dating as early as when the Babylonian captivity was happening, the majority of folks, if not all practicing Jews of that time, would tell you that they were given authority in terms of the doctrine, the teaching, whatever, through two routes. So number one, the written law, right? That's what we can pick up and hold up. That's the Torah, Genesis, what Moses wrote. By Babylonian captivity, I believe some of the prophets would have been in publication, not the right word there, but they would have copies of that. And that makes sense. You read that, you understand that that's God teaching to you, that is authority. There's this second part of it that I had never really given much credence to, never really took much time to understand. And that is the idea of the oral law. And that is the law that was passed down. So for me, my immediate thought on that is well, where on earth does that come from, right? You're telling me that a Jew back then genuinely believed that that was on par with what I'm reading in the book. How on earth do we get there? And so looking back at how the law started, I want to look at Exodus 24. I'm going to read that in just a second. But I wanted to give some context to leading up to 24, because I think context is always really important. So Exodus 20, we have the 10 Commandments being given. 21, 22, 23, you've got kind of the book of the laws presented. It's like how the laws work within society. If I punch my neighbor's cow, what happens next? If someone falls in a ditch, but it's on a Tuesday at 4, what are the rules? That is the part that a lot of folks skip over, right? When we're reading through the law being given. But then we get to 24, and it's the idea of the actual covenant being formed between God and his people. You read of the blood being basically spilled out on the people, the idea of Moses going up to the mountain. And we're going to pick up in verse 12 of chapter 24. It says, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment which I have written for you.' So Moses rose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up to the mountain of God, and he said to the elders, 'Wait here for us until we return, and behold, Aaron and Hur are with you here. Whoever has a dispute, let him go to them.' Then Moses went up to the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the 7th day he called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain, and Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So who here wants to tell me what happened on that mountain for 40 days and 40 nights? I don't.
That's when they set up the golden calf.
Sure. So we know what happened off the mountain. What happened on the mountain? I finally got a question that I can't get you there with. No, we don't know, right? We aren't told. We're not given the information of what Moses is doing up there other than getting the law. But we're told that the written law itself is contained on the commandments and the stones. But 40 days, 40 nights, that's a long time. So by the time we get to Babylonian captivity, the idea that, it wasn't just the law being given, but Moses was also told how to interpret the law and what to do here and how to handle this. And kind of the unknown and the uncertainty can lead you to maybe connecting dots that weren't there. And then what does Moses do with the law that he got from God when the next leader comes? What is the kind of the process there? Yeah, he passed it down to the next spiritual leader of Israel, which is Joshua, the guy that walked up with him. And Joshua passes it down. And over and over and over for generations and generations, in a world without a printing press, the law is being given from person to person to person to person. And I think I've joked about the inefficiency of the telephone game before, but that is not always the most reliable way for a message to be passed. So now take into account that it's not just the law being given, but it's also now the interpretation being given. Right? We talked earlier about how rabbis would teach their interpretation to the group, and that would be taken and held on to, right? So I want to read two lengthier excerpts here from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, a real fun read in your spare time. This is under tradition within this book. It says, behind the authority of the Jewish fathers was seen the authority of God. The religious heritage was God's Torah, which in essence was given at Sinai. The rabbis made a distinction between the written Torah and the oral Torah, i.e., between the authoritative Holy Scripture, the Old Testament, and an orally transmitted authoritative tradition, which interprets, supplements, and sometimes corrects the written Torah. Now, you might be reading this and say, that seems pretty far-fetched. In our world, I don't think any of you would give me a commentary written by some author and say, you need to read this. This has the same authority and weight as the Bible, right? We all would immediately think that's pretty fishy. But in this world that they're living in, the law as it's being passed down, the interpretation is being passed down too. And potentially correcting or amending is being passed down too. And so another, again, a real fun read. From the same chunk there within this excerpt, it says, the term tradition in the New Testament has apparently three meanings. It means in Jewish theology the oral teachings of the elders or the distinguished ancestors, right, from Moses on, which were reverenced by the late Jews equally with the written teachings of the Old Testament and were regarded by them as equally authoritative on matters of belief and conduct. There seem to be three classes of these oral teachings. Some oral laws of Moses, as they suppose, were given by the great lawgiver in addition to the written law. So essentially Moses added to, basically whether it was him directly or through the writing, and they took that as law. Decisions of various judges which became precedents in judicial matters. This is big too. If these people are going to their spiritual leaders to help make decisions, and you know that, Priest John said that in this determination, this is what he believes, that then gets taken as, well, that's it then. That is now written in stone type of thinking. And then finally, interpretations of great teachers or rabbis, which we see a lot of in the New Testament, which came to be prized with the same reverence as were the Old Testament scriptures. So I'm going to pause, give myself a breath, give your brains a break from listening for a second. If you've never heard this before, I know that this can be a very odd thing. I myself felt very similarly the first time I kind of started thinking about this. But the reason I have come to feel as strongly as I have about this is because when you get to the Mark 7s and you see how strong Jesus is in teaching against the traditions and fighting against all of these preconceived notions, it makes a lot of sense. And then on the flip side of it, if we're to believe that these traditions, right, are viewed by the scribes, the Pharisees, the lawyers, as authoritative pieces of doctrine, does that maybe help us understand why they were so irate with how Jesus handled things? When I've heard Mark 7 explained before, and I don't think there's anything wrong with the interpretation, if the thinking is just they want to stay in power, they make their own rules, they don't like that people break their rules, I have a hard time piecing together the hatred that's felt on one side and the disappointment that's felt on Jesus' side. So to me, taking in this idea that maybe they were holding these teachings to an esteem that is only held for God's law maybe makes a little sense on why the conflict was so strong. So again, when we get to Mark 7, if we're viewing these traditions as things that they thought had the authority of God themselves, it changes the way we read it. And again, maybe you're thinking, Ethan read some big books, and that's great, and I'm with you there. I want to provide some examples that I think maybe helps with that thinking. So the first question, and I hope I only showed the first part. All right. How many times can a Jewish criminal be whipped according to the law? I heard 39. What's the King James Version for all my fun King James folks? Anyone remember? Yeah, 40 and save one, right? So 39. That is the law. And where do we get that from? Does anyone remember where that wording is shared? It's by an apostle who wrote a lot of stuff. Do you remember who said it? The where's less important, I guess. So in 2 Corinthians 11 and 24, when Paul is talking about all of the terrible, terrible, terrible things he has been going through, primarily for the sake of Christ, we get the verbiage that's stuck in everyone's mind, 40 lashes less one. So why is it then in Deuteronomy 25, when the law was given, the law says you should hit them 40 times, but no more? That's interesting to me as a reader. So you go back to the original law, the law is you should is such a weird word to use here. You can beat them, still weird, 40 times, but no more. Fast forward a few hundred years, and we get to the point here in the New Testament where this same law is being followed, but what is universally held is 40 minus 1. Why do you think that is? Afraid of miscounting, the mathematical dilemma, absolutely. And why are they afraid of miscounting? They don't want to break the law. I think it's safe to assume probably someone might have miscounted in the past, right? But so what's the purpose? They don't want to miscount. This is their solution. What have they essentially done? Sure, you can say they've changed the law, you've moved the goalpost essentially. I'm not sure if you've heard this phrase, but the idea of building a hedge around the law is what comes to my mind. They said the line is here, we never want to cross this, so what we're going to say from here on out is this line minus 1, right? They've built a hedge. They have put into place something to prevent people from crossing and breaking the law. So that idea is not just seen in this one instance, though I think it is a very good and easy example to try to get your mind around. But when you look, I think in Matthew 7, when it comes to the Sermon on the Mount and a few other times, there's a lot of back and forth between Jesus and the people, insert whoever, where it is you have heard it said this, but in reality this. You have been taught this, but I say to you this. You also then go back a couple chapters in Mark and you hear the people marvel at the authority by which he spoke. And you start to say, that's interesting, right? What has changed? And so I want to put up two questions, and I want to hear your thoughts on either one. The first question, do you think this idea of putting a hedge around the law is a good idea or a bad idea? And the second question, if that's where you'd rather go, do you think the people who created it had bad motives or good motives? Yeah.
One of the things, in addition to that, is the Jewish law is a case law system, which is something we're familiar with. So God makes a rule. Judges, over the course of the Old Testament, interpret that rule in a variety of cases. That interpretation becomes the law. And so sometimes I think it's not even necessarily that they set about to set a hedge, but just like the
Anyone else? Thoughts on these two questions? Yes, sir.
In Deuteronomy, there when he's talking about the number of lashes, God gives some leeway there. It says you can give what's according to the extent of the crime that was punished. So if it was a small misdemeanor, then they might be only.
One legally use less than 40 lashes. He says you can make it according to the crime was committed, but don't give more than 40. So there was a area of leeway there, and that's where the Mishnah and later it was actually formulated. That's where the jurists, if you will, all the Pharisees, they were looking at these laws, said, well, what actually is, from 1 to 40, what should it be if you steal a bottle of oil? What should it be if you steal a sheep? What should it be if you steal? Because there was a lot of laxity they're getting. God gives credence to us using judgment. And so they were trying to fill in the judgment parts.
Sure, and I think that's totally valid. To me, based off of how Paul was treated everywhere else, it's hard for me to think that he wouldn't have been given the maximum. And so for me, it's hard to think, well, if 40 is still their maximum, and they just held off one, right? It seems like that thought process was ingrained, where they did all that they could without crossing that line. And that's where I think the idea of the hedge comes in. And again, human logic says, how did we go from 40 to 40 minus 1? I think it's a safety play, right? And so, again, the idea of putting something in to protect you from crossing the line. General thoughts, good or bad?
I think it depends on the type of person you are, because I am such a rule follower. I want to know exactly what the rule is so I don't get in trouble. And isn't that idea of the hedge, is that the little safety zone there, that's how I've always thought about it.
Yeah. I don't, oh, yes, sir.
I was going to say, in theory, it's good because it's saying, hey, I love the law so much, I want to follow it, that I'm going to stop before I get to the maximum. But when you start holding other people to that and judging them by what you're going by, that's where it becomes a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think at its core, this is a bad thing. I don't think the idea of wanting to put, I mean, Lawrence had a whole series, right? Guardrails on the road is a bad idea to prevent something worse from happening. And I also can't imagine the people who instituted these changes or started to do it had bad motives. To me, it's a leader of a group wanting to take care of the flock in whatever way that might be. But when we fast forward to the time where we get to Mark 7, what we're seeing is spiritual leaders holding in disdain Jesus, his followers, others, because they're not holding to the traditions of washing hands in a certain way. And if you go look through the old law to find what they're pulling that from, you won't find it. What you will find are some washing rituals for various spiritual leaders, but the washing your hands before a meal thing, because even here it states it wasn't for cleanliness. It's not like what we should be doing, right? Should be, everyone. But like this was different. This was a purification. This was a cleansing. But there's nowhere in the old law where they pulled that. So something has changed. Something has perverted or changed what the norm was and what was originally given by the time we get to where we are in our story. And I think Sterling's point is huge because that was we had judges, we had kings, we had Moses, Joshua, spiritual leaders with connections who, if they were to say this is the ruling, it would be really hard to push against that. And so that is kind of what's gotten us to where we are in Mark. And so my question, and Eric kind of touched on it, do we build hedges around the law? As we look at how we assess God's law for his people, all of the church, the Christians, correct? Like when God puts the law in place for his people, do we build hedges around the law? What do you all think? Seeing some head nods. What are some I'm not trying to jump into something super crazy here, but like, what are some examples you can think of? Because I think there's a couple that are pretty universally viewed that we can discuss without getting too heated. What's something where we put some hedges, potentially? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, where you're putting your hedge, comparing it to someone else's hedge. I have not beat my child 35 times. She's very small. But yeah, the idea is there. I'm going to throw some ideas out. No one has to make any faces. We can all just think. What about alcohol? Where are there examples where maybe, for good or bad, we have set hedges for ourselves based on our convictions that might be further away from what the actual biblical teaching is? Is that a bad thing? No. There's nothing wrong with putting things into place to prevent you from doing something that does not need to be done. To Eric's point, when do the hedges become a problem? When we start maybe holding other people accountable to where they line up against our hedge rather than where they line up against the actual law itself. And there are many, 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 many examples that we could talk about that say, like, show that these aren't bad things, it's how they're used. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. And I see the example of the Wednesday night Bible class tradition as an Orange Danish tradition. Does that make sense? That is our version of tradition. This thing that we've decided to do, we repeat it, we pass it down. I would hope that none of us here are holding everyone else in the world accountable to where you must meet on a Wednesday night in order to be compliant with the law, right? I would, yes, sir.
But how we get around that is, we say the elders tell us to be here. That's again another rule, like the Pharisees did.
I'm okay with that opinion, and we can definitely talk about it later without derailing the class. I think within this world, though, this is not an interpretation of leadership. It's how am I essentially viewing my relationship with God's law, and has that been impacted by what God says or what I have thought? Or in their case, what God says or what I've heard from my rabbi, from my father, from my grandfather and his father. Because by the time we get here, this idea of the understanding, the teaching, the judgments being passed down have impacted them to the extent that they seem, if the leadership feels it, I'm guessing you see it elsewhere, what they are doing is held at the same level of right and wrong, to where when Jesus is not partaking, he's not doing something inconvenient or culturally odd, he's doing something wrong. And so that's kind of where I'm thinking, how did we get here? Yes, sir.
This might kind of be what you're building towards, so I'm sorry if I take the punchline.
You do your thing.
We've kind of danced around it, but we haven't actually said that when we do this, when we hold other people to the standard of our edge, we are putting ourselves in the place of God. We are making ourselves judge and executor. And the thing is we try to punish and judge people for that, whereas the person who drew the real line
Yeah, and we could go down a path of meat offered to idols, right? Or meat eaten that was sacrificed to idols. An idea of, yes, this group is in the right. No, their conclusion's not correct. But that said, don't be a stumbling block, right? We have pretty good examples of instances like that. But when it comes to the world that we are dwelling in Mark 7, it seems like that logic is not there. And that's where, again, the reason I wanted to talk about this, as weird as it might be, is it changes the way you can read a lot of New Testament, not just the bad examples, but the good. There's a slide later, we won't even get to it, with all the examples where the exact words here to talk about tradition and how it's passed are used by the apostles and the writers of the New Testament to talk about God's word being handed down. So it's not that the idea is bad, it's the execution of the thought. Yes, ma'am. Okay. So, yeah. Yes, ma'am. No, you're good. Yeah, and the way that we're going to see later in this chapter, Jesus described these people are hypocrites, which is not a fun word, but unfortunately is a word that's incredibly associated with Christianity in modern day, and I don't think that that's a massive surprise. And so for me, it's let's understand where they're failing so that we can be better. Mr. Underwood. Oh, for sure. Yeah. No, that's a great point. And hopefully my scattered brain did not maybe separate those as best as they should. There is the idea of the hedge here in terms of how the law is changing or being maybe adjusted by some by the time we get to the New Testament. But there's also just a blatant dismissal of where true authority is coming from. And I think that is just, it is what it is. If they are holding others, and you got to think, if the Pharisees feel this way, who are they then passing that information on to? All of these people underneath them that view them as the voice of reason. And when you think of the scribes, and slides are gone at this point. When you think of the scribes and the Pharisees and these people in these positions, and you think that not everyone is learned and not everyone can write, these are the people who are controlling what puts pen to paper. And so it's not wild to think that the rabbis here or the scribes or the Pharisees are maybe not copying it down just as it should be. And talking about hedges, I mean, the best example I can give is talking about the Sabbath. You read in Acts, there's a Sabbath day journey. What is that, right? Essentially, it is the amount of distance that they determined you could travel on a Sabbath without making it work. Don't know where that's coming from, right? But if you go back to Exodus when the law was given and you read what the Sabbath really was, it makes sense why they were so concerned not to break it. Because the punishments for breaking the Sabbath were not things I'd want to mess with. In chapter 31, there are back-to-back punishments, the first one being taken away or essentially disassociated with your people, and then death, which I feel like if the second happens, the first probably happens too. So I get it. But that somehow has become, and this sounds wild, I promise you it's real, in Judaism today, within some of the more orthodox groups and even some that aren't, I can read you, and if we had time, we would. It's not funny, but it's interesting. If you go to Torah.org, whatever, or the actual printed version, there are like 17 rules on which knots you can and can't tie on the Sabbath, when you can do it. If it's going to be untied within 24 hours, that's fine. But if it's not, don't do it. And the idea you can't create a spark or start a fire, back then that made plenty of sense. But now, what about electricity? How does that work? It's making a spark. So now you have Sabbath elevators that for some parts of the day are just left running. And if you're on a skyscraper, you're going to stop at all 90 floors, hopefully until you get where you're going. None of that was a part of the Sabbath. But when the concern, for whatever the reason, is messing up, you take the advice, the judge's ruling, and you move further and further away from the truth, and at some point you might forget what the truth even was. And so a lot of time has passed from Moses to where we are now. And so just thinking, which I have done, of like, wow, I don't understand why they would be so upset about him not washing his hands. Or I don't know why Jesus would come out swinging at that accusation. If they believe these things were told to them with the authority of the Father, it makes a lot of sense why we walk into Mark 7 with the general attitude we do. So I'm teaching Sunday. You're stuck with me. We're going to pick this up on Sunday. Not as much into all this. I appreciate you all so much for bearing with me and thinking through this. And if you walk away completely disagreeing, that's okay. If you want to talk or ask questions, I personally have been thinking through this a lot and trying to get my own mind in a place where I can present it. But thank you for this. We're going to pick up in Mark 7 on Sunday. I believe it's 1 through 23. So if you would, read those verses and we'll pick it up then. Thank you very much.